Welcome to this series in understanding what data types are. In the previous session, we have actually acquainted ourselves to the platform of VS Code. In this session, where we want to now begin to actually get to the basics, actually start coding itself, understanding the concept. There is one particular thing that is very important, or that runs always in every programming language, is understanding data types. Basically, we are going to refer to that's a form of a syntax, right? But then data types is something that runs through everyone. So what do we actually mean by data types? So regularly in every day when we are talking, right, when we are conversing or we are writing, we see that we write in English in different forms. Like we have the alphabet form, that we use alphabet to write words, and we have numbers, right? And then aside that, what do we use again? We use symbols, right? The and, the apostrophe, the exclamation marks, and all that. We use all that when we are conversing in normal English or when we are writing, right? So we said we have the alphabet that we combine to make words, and we also have numbers in general, and then the last one we have symbols, right? Yeah, that's what. So our data that we have that we use, we call them data. So those are data in general. So I just classify them into types for you. The alphabet for making words, the numbers for calculation or counting, and then the last one is the symbols that aid us in making the words and everything like more meaningful. So programming languages also have that, and we call them data types. So they are data for them, but then they have different types of those data, which we want to look at today. So I'll actually cite the one that we have first. Like in English, we said we have alphabet, right? We have alphabet. Then we have numbers. Yes, we have numbers. Then numbers we have what? Symbols. Yeah, symbols. That's what we. This is what these are the things that we have in normal English. But in programming language, right? When we are going to converse with them or we are going to use them, basically we need something like that. Okay. But then their own, they use alphabets, numbers, and order, but they have a different kind of classification to them, how they look at it and how they classify each, even though they use the same thing. But then their own is a different one in a different way. So the very first one, an example of a data type, one type of data that they understand are strings. Strings. That's the first one. But then we'll talk about that. We'll actually try to understand it more. Then another form of data that they also understand that yes, this one, yeah, we said they are also numbers, right? They are numbers and symbols. Hmm, not symbols, right? Because the symbols we can put them in the strings. We talk about that later on. But then we also have another data type called the Boolean data type. So there are these are the basic one that we need to understand at the moment. We need to start with these ones firstly, right? And then understand how they work and how Python or most programming languages understand them. Okay. So now we have strings, we have numbers, and we have the boolean, right? So these are the basic three data types that they have. Now, what are strings? What are numbers? What are boolean? Strings, right, are basically how programming, but let's focus on Python. How Python understand or classify something that as a string is by putting it between quotation mark. So whatever you want to write, right, you put them within quotation marks, single quotation marks or double quotation marks. Anything you put within that quotation mark, right, Python is going to see it as a string. So an example of a string. So let's say this one is going to be, let me give a space and write this one for you. Anything that we put within single or double quotes. Note, we are trying to understand the basis so that you can relate to what we are meaning. And when you find something in programming language, right, you can find your own way of understanding it, right? But then strings in the basic term to the layman is anything that you put within the quotation mark, either single or double, right? That's what we put. So if you put a number within a quotation mark, Python is going to see not going to see it as numbers, but it's going to see it as a string. That's how Python will classify it. So anything at all, whether symbol, whether number, whether word, whenever you put it within quotation mark, single or double, Python is going to see it as a string. In a section of the triple quotation mark, which I'm using here, the triple quotation mark are for commenting. We saw that when we are understanding commenting. But when you're using the single or double quotation mark, anything you put within that, Python is going to recognize it as a string because that's each type of data type. Now, the next one, to an example of that is, so example of anything that we can have now, we can have, I have this single quotation mark two, right? You see that this my two is within the quotation mark, single quotation mark. Or I can also have it in a way that I can have this combination of them, right? All of them, Python is going to see them as strings. All of them are strings. Or even if I want to write words, this is an example, right? So when I put this in like this, right, is this an example? The sentence this an example is within a quotation mark. It can be a single, right? It can be a double. I can also make it double. Let's say this is another example, right? Another example, yes. So it's also within double quotation mark. So when it's also in double quotation mark, Python will still recognize it as a string. Right? So anything within single quotation mark or double quotation mark is a form of data type for Python programming, and that type of data type is a string data type. Now the second one is, let's go to numbers in general. Numbers in general. Okay. Yeah. When you say numbers, right, you look at two, three, four, five, six. But then programming language are more specific to some types of numbers. So the numbers that you have, they are going to have different types under them. So there are some that are just counting numbers, like normal integers, integer numbers. Every integer number is a counting number, right? So counting integer numbers are one that do not have the decimal point. They don't have the decimal point. So it's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, -1, -2. Just the normal integer numbers, right? So Python also recognize those type of numbers as integers. So an example, so we have different types, right? Let me put this one in this. So the first type, we have three types again. The first one is integers. Integers. So Python is going to be so all counting integers, right? Those without what? The without what decimal point. So if you don't have the decimal point, you are going to be what? An integer for in. Here we are referring to numbers. So we are referring to numbers. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 numbers. Okay. The next one, the next type of data type or number that Python also understand or programming language will understand is double, double or float. Those ones are numbers that contain the decimal point. They contain the decimal point. So the first one is going to be double, like double, just like double, right? But then well, let's focus on float first. Float is another type. Float is another data type. So this one contain. So let me write float stroke double. Yeah. So contain decimal point. Yeah, by default contain decimal point. Now, so an example. Let me put an example first. An example of float is 2.0. Right? 2.0 is a floating point number. Floating point number. So let me call it floating point number. Float or floating point and double. Floating point number. Then when I have something like um two, just two like that, just two, Python is going to see it as an integer because this one does not have a decimal point, right? Yes. So these are the various types. So that I can have 5 points like this, right? So this is also an example, another example because it's having a decimal point. Whenever I have a decimal point, it's going to be a floating point number. Okay. Now the Boolean are logics, right? These are logics. These are just logics. Why logics, right? The logic, I mean, right, they have only two values under them. It's either true or false. That's for them, right? Let me actually put a space within this so that you can see them separately. Yeah. So now the Boolean, right? They are the logic kind of data types. So either something is true or something is false. That's for the Boolean, right? That's the third data type. The first data type we say they are strings, right? Strings are anything within the quotation mark or double quotation mark. The numbers, right? There are three types. They have the integers. The integer is just a normal counting number, 0, 1, 2, 3. But all the other data types that have the decimal points, like the float and the double, right? Float or double. Python, we are going to focus more on floats, right? Float is going to be an example, but then the basic understanding of float and double is that on the memory, right? In the memory, float occupies less space than the double. That's just the difference. So double will have more decimal points or decimal places. If something is double, right, it will have more decimal places. But if something is float, it will have less decimal places. Let's have that as the basis for now. We'll delve deep into that when we are moving forward. But for Python, right, we are mostly concerned with just floats and working with floats currently. So most of the time, we see Python recognizing numbers that are having decimal points called as just float. They are just called as floats. That's how Python recognizes them, right? So we are going to also work with that. Maybe other programming language will be stressing on double and floats more frequently.